Here we gave an overview, and we moved over a whole range of related concepts. What we're going to do is we're going to look at the literature review a little bit more further in this video, which will lead to a series of steps of how to undertake it and just dig into it a little bit further. Okay, so the very first thing that we've said, and we need to emphasize this, is that literature review is an approach or a method of research. Okay, you can get new forms of knowledge. Now you might say to yourself, that's ridiculous. How can reading a bunch of articles actually give me anything new? Well, a very good example is the type of literature review which is called a meta-analysis. Meta-analyses do things where they gather together several different articles over a particular topic. They lift out of those articles key elements, and they show that the connection between the concepts, because each article in itself may not say it, but the connection between a group of 4 or 5 critical articles can itself make a point, but you cannot draw that point out unless you survey and analyze, say, 4 or 5 of these critical articles. That kind of analysis is called a meta-analysis, because you're using material already researched and you're drawing out from them and combining them to show it's possible to create a new concept or a new idea or a new piece of knowledge. So when you are thinking about a literature review as an isolated activity, you must see it not just as a way of leading to research, which I emphasized in my first video, but also as a method of research itself, which can lead to new forms of knowledge. The absolute ideal way of doing the literature review is to come up with something new based on an analysis of a group of selected articles. To emphasize another point, there are a number of different types of literature reviews. There's the so-called meta-analysis. There's, as we've already introduced, the narrative form of analysis, which is often traditional. There is the systematic review as well. Now, these are probably the most familiar or popular ones. Meta-analysis, I've just given you an idea. Narrative is the traditional one, and we discussed that in the previous video. Systematic review is often used to actually draw out of a group of articles, say, certain critical facts. So if you go through 4 or 5 articles, you're not necessarily trying to look for some original and develop a new piece of knowledge. That might come out of something called a meta-analysis. With the systematic review, you are reading it to draw out the key new concepts, statistical information, and so on. Generally speaking, the kind of reviews we ask undergraduates to do tend to be called the narrative ones or the traditional ones. And the purpose, as I've stated before, is that you're researching a topic or a question to critically analyze it. So we'll draw that out a little bit further. Okay, so there are different types, as we've said. Now, there are several elements to a literature review, and you need to bear this in mind. Okay, so if we're looking at it broadly in terms of planning how you approach it, the first thing is, at the center of your first phase are your sources. And so having a method or an approach to how will you select your sources is a critical element. In a very short literature review, you may not have much time to discuss that. So you can't often say, my method of approaching my sources were to look at journals which had this standing, which were heavily reviewed, etc., etc. You set out some kind of criteria, right, or set of standards of what you are going to set for what are relevant and credible sources for your approach. The issue of the quality of your literature review will depend on this initial step, this decision and approach of what sources are relevant. you can write a very well written piece of text, but if your sources you use are poor, that will reflect on the literature review itself. Because what you're going to have to try to do is once you've gathered your sources, you analyze, and some of the work is synthesize. So we'll kind of emphasize that in the previous video we talked about summarizing, but a sharper way. Summarizing is a good step in, but synthesizing is actually more critical. For example, if Article 1 makes a point about a particular concept, and Article 2 makes a similar or overlapping thing about the same concept, somewhere in it, and this say somewhere in there. What you do is you draw those two concepts out and you discuss that concept that was present in those two elements, those two particular different sources, of course, there. And by synthesizing it, you unify it. You say that here's a typical idea. So, for example, if the concept here is discussed in certain aspects and features, over here it's discussed in other features, but there's an overlap, and they actually connect up to give you a much richer grasp of what that concept is, that's a typical way that you would synthesize information. Now, let's talk about some other features of when you're planning it. So, we are not going to spend much time talking about a systematic review. We are going to focus more on the traditional or narrative, which overlaps with systematic and what we call a meta-analysis. They overlap with each other. They have properties in common because they're all forms of literature review, but we're going to stick to the more traditional one. Why do I say that? Because even under what's called a systematic review, a literature review, one of the things you do is you identify and evaluate the research, and it tends to be a little bit empirical, right? It can move in a slightly different dimension. When you're looking at a theory, looking at a purely empirical set of data, right? Empirical means data, just for those who don't know. But when you go through your articles, you're looking at the data. But systematic literature review only has limited application if you're asked to discuss a research topic where it's not just about data, it's also about concepts, developments, and theories. And when you're dealing with this is why you need what we call a semi-systematic or a traditional literature review. It's broader, it gives you more flexibility, and allows you to bring in various different other elements. Okay, so let's move on. We're not worried about, and when you deal with a systematic literature review, you would have to involve statistical methods. Say you would find a collection of sources, you would analyze their stats, you might develop a statistical model and work with those, etc. So this only has partial value when you're thinking about the typical kind of literature review you're interested in. So what are you interested in? You are really interested in, now again, there are several different ways that we discuss this, but we will give you all the related terms. What's called a semi-systematic or a narrative review. Now this is more likely to be the type of literature review that you will get involved in. What does it involve? Well, it involves overviewing a topic, and it looks at how research within a selected field has developed over time. So you're also going to look at developments, both in the concepts and technologies, but also in the research related to those technologies. So development becomes really, really important. And you're trying to understand all the relevant research traditions that link to the topic. Okay, so you're trying to understand all the relevant concepts, and this is where it gets quite challenging. When you're dealing with a literature review, a semi-systematic literature review for a topic, you've got to make some judgments on which bits are relevant and what you're going to leave out and what you're going to stay in. What are the standards and criteria for you to do such a thing, right? And then once you do it, as we said before, you synthesize these various different sources, and you create, if you like, a new story, if you like, or the beginnings of a new story. So when we say narrative, another way of thinking about that is that you're looking at the development of a technology like a story. Okay. Now there are all kinds of different approaches, and of how you're going to analyze it, and so maybe we'll give you some initial indicators here, of what you might do. We're going to try to give you some general guidance, but what we want to do in the next series of videos is talk about the different phases of how you're going to go about tackling it. So just to bring this second video to an end, it's a little bit shorter than the first, to emphasize the related concepts that we're interested in. We're interested in undertaking a semi-systematic literature review, which means that you might do some number crunching of information, but you're also dealing with concepts, developments, and theories of a particular area. And you are trying to analyze this stuff, take out key elements, right? So if you imagine these are your sources and these all represent different articles and journals, right? Or books, or so you kind of gather them together and you draw out, say, a particular concept, and that one and that one and that one contribute towards a second concept, and say that one and maybe that one there contribute towards a third concept. Then you look at the relationship between these concepts and you look at issues of inconsistencies, gaps, what it means, whether it does hold a whole series of implications, and you see whether you can synthesize that into some kind of knowledge or overall concept. Now that's kind of a very ambitious image of it, where the various different combinations of articles allow you to draw out different concepts. You look at you discuss the relation of these concepts and whether that provides you with some new knowledge. That's the absolute ideal model behind literature review. It also comes with this: when you look at the 3 or 4 concepts, what you might find is that there's a gap, there's a question left over in that one, and say there's another question left over in that one, and that series of questions on what's left over becomes the point of your literature review. So you might analyze 4 or 5 articles and find 2 of them have left certain things out and you spot it, or one article mentions a subject but dismisses it, and the others say this is a problem that hasn't been resolved. So you have questions and gaps and potentially inconsistencies. That can become your focal point for how you understand the state of the knowledge related to this particular technology. And remember, because it's narrative, there's a developmental element to it as well. We'll come back to this and try to pick out this in more general terms. What I'd like to do now is just talk about the different phases of undertaking a research, and through that process perhaps generalize it a bit to give you some more guidance.